This is Land of Havilah, Psalm 78. It's 72 verses. Verse 1. A contemplation by Asaph. Hear my teaching, my people. Turn your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. Comment in verse 2. A dark saying is something that we don't know how to interpret. If we're going to understand the Bible, we need to have the Holy Spirit explain its dark sayings. It was said of Daniel that he had, quote, an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpretation of dreams, showing of dark sentences, and dissolving of doubts, Daniel 5:12. When Daniel explained something, it was by the Holy Spirit, and the explanation was so good, it dissolved any doubt that he was correct. So the psalmist says in verse 2, he'll utter dark sayings of old. He's going to retell mysteries which were passed down from the fathers in verse 3, which means from previous generations. He doesn't say he'll interpret that mystery for us. He only says he'll retell the mystery in the same mysterious fashion that the fathers told it. It's up to the Holy Spirit in us to give us the interpretation. Speaking of those mysteries from long ago, verse 4, we will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of Yahweh, his strength and his wondrous deeds that he has done. Comment, what's coming is a sweeping history of Israel, concentrating on the Exodus a lot, then moving from there through the history of Israel up to David. It's a great mystery to figure out the meaning of it all, the way God interacted with his people and led them along. There's the implication here that this wasn't a series of meaningless events. There's meaning in the history. God was weaving the story of Christ is what he was doing. Verse 5. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a teaching in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children who should be born, who should arise and tell their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget God's deeds, but keep his commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that didn't make their hearts loyal, whose spirit was not steadfast with God. Comment in verse 7, God established a testimony in Jacob, meaning he uses the history of Israel to teach us. He commanded the fathers to teach the children, generation after generation, what he did to deliver Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land. That's where all this is going, and it's also going to the fact that this was all a history of our deliverance by Christ. This history should be taught to the people of Israel so they never forget God's deeds in verse 7, that they might set their hope in God and not be stubborn and rebellious against him. God commanded Moses to command the people to remember. It's perhaps the most frequently repeated commandment in the law of Moses that the people of Israel should keep remembering how God so miraculously delivered them from Egypt and teach it to their children. Verse 9. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They didn't keep God's covenant and refused to walk in his law. They forgot his doings, his wondrous deeds that he had shown them. Comment in verses 9 to 11, the tribe of Ephraim, which was part of Israel, wasn't faithful to God. They forgot his doings of the past. The psalmist says this because when the Israelites came into the Promised Land, the tabernacle and the ark were originally in Shiloh of Ephraim. That was a place God chose to put his name, so to speak. But it must be that the Ephraimites were unfaithful to God because God moved his dwelling place to Mount Zion of Jerusalem, Jeremiah 7:15. The same statement will also be coming up in this psalm in verses 67 to 68, that the Ephraimites forsook God. Now, speaking of some of God's marvelous deeds of the Exodus that Ephraim forgot about, verse 12, he did marvelous things in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt in the field of Zoan. Comment, field of Zoan is another term for Egypt. Speaking of God's marvelous deeds there, this is all familiar from the books of Moses, verse 13. He split the sea and caused them to pass through. He made the waters stand as a heap. In the daytime he also led them with a cloud, and all night with a light of fire. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly out of the depths. He brought streams also out of the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. Yet they still went on to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. They tempted God in their heart by asking food according to their desire. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, "Can God prepare a table in the wilderness?" Behold, he struck the rock so that the waters gushed out, and streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Will he provide meat for his people? Therefore Yahweh heard and was angry. A fire was kindled against Jacob. Anger also went up against Israel, because they didn't believe in God and didn't trust in his salvation. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. He rained down manna on them to eat and gave them food from the sky. Men ate the bread of angels. He sent them food to the full. He caused the east wind to blow in the sky. By his power he guided the south wind. He rained also meat on them as the dust, winged birds, as the sand of the seas. He let them fall in the middle of their camp, around their habitations. So they ate and were filled. He gave them their own desire. They didn't turn from their cravings. Their food was yet in their mouths, when the anger of God went up against them, killed some of their fattest, and struck down the young men of Israel. For all this they still sinned and didn't believe in his wondrous works. Comment in verse 13, God parted the Red Sea. In verse 14, he led Israel with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. In verses 15 and 16, since there was no water, he split open rocks in the desert, which poured out water, and they drank. Verses 17 to 20, they rebelled by repeatedly whining, complaining, and panicking that there was no water, no bread, and no meat. But in reality, they ate bread from heaven like angels, meaning God gave them manna in verse 25. He completely provided for them, but they didn't trust God, though God always came through. Verses 26 to 29 recall how God provided meat. He made a wind that blew in quail. The quail fell around the camp until they were stacked 3 feet deep, a day's journey in every direction, Numbers 11:31. Yet after all this, they still complained in the wilderness and panicked that God wouldn't take care of them in verses 30 to 32, and God killed some of them in his anger. Coming up after 2 years of them rejecting God, God rejected that generation. He made them live out their lives in the desert. He didn't bring them into the promised land. Verse 33. Therefore he consumed their days in vanity and their years in terror. When he killed them, then they inquired after him. They returned and sought God earnestly. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. But they flattered him with their mouth and lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not right with him, neither were they faithful in his covenant. But he, being merciful, forgave iniquity and didn't destroy them. Yes, many times he turned his anger away and didn't stir up all his wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes away and doesn't come again. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They turned again and tempted God and provoked the Holy One of Israel. Comment, it was a long saga of rebellion in the desert over and over, verse 42. They didn't remember his hand, nor the day when he redeemed them from the adversary, how he set his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the field of Zoan. He turned their rivers into blood and their streams so that they could not drink. Comment in verse 42, the Israelites didn't remember the hand of God, all the wonders he did in the Exodus. 13 times in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses commanded that second generation of the Exodus to remember what God had done in Egypt and along the way as they went through the desert. Many of the ones who entered the Promised Land didn't remember the Exodus because they were born afterward in the desert. Therefore, God commanded them to remember the descriptions of it from their fathers, and as the years went by, to remember it from Moses' writings. Remember, don't forget what God has done. Coming up, as for part of that history, they shouldn't forget the 10 plagues, verse 45. He sent among them swarms of flies, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. He gave also their increase to the caterpillar, and their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, their sycamore trees with frost. He gave over their livestock also to the hail, and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. He threw on them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, indignation, and trouble, and a band of angels of evil. He made a path for his anger. He didn't spare their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence, and struck all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tents of Ham. But he led out his own people like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them safely so that they weren't afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. He brought them to the border of his sanctuary, to this mountain which his right hand had taken. Comment: 3 months after leaving Egypt, God brought them to Mount Sinai. God's right hand took the mountain, meaning he brought them there with power. God was the power behind the 10 plagues, the Red Sea, and the many other miracles that got them there. Now, speaking of how God drove the nations out of the promised land for them, and how once they were in the promised land, they continued to rebel against him. This is a continuation of their history. We're supposed to be drawing some lessons from it. Verse 55. He also drove out the nations before them, allotted them for an inheritance line by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Yet they tempted and rebelled against the Most High God, and didn't keep his testimonies, but turned back and dealt treacherously like their fathers. They were twisted like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their engraved images. Comment: they built altars, shrines, and idols to other gods on high places, which are the tops of hills. This provoked God to anger. Verse 59. When God heard this, he was angry and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he abandoned the tent of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, his glory into the adversary's hand. Comment: after hundreds of years of the ark being in the tabernacle at Shiloh, God delivered his strength into captivity, his glory into the adversary's hand, meaning he allowed the Philistines to capture the ark. 1 Samuel 5:1. The tabernacle in Shiloh after that had no ark. The glory was departed from it and from Israel. 1 Samuel 4:22. Speaking of how the Philistines plundered Israel during that time, verse 62. He also gave his people over to the sword and was angry with his inheritance. Fire devoured their young men. Their virgins had no wedding song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows couldn't weep. Comment in verse 63, fire devoured their young men. It was actually in battle that they died. That was God's fiery wrath against them. 30,000 of them on the day the Philistines took the ark. 1 Samuel 4:10. In verse 64, the priests fell by the sword, and their widows couldn't weep. Those were the priests Hophni and Phinehas. They died on the battlefield that day. Their widows were stunned. 1 Samuel 4:19-22. This took place when Samuel was a boy, which was in the generation before David. Coming up, when David came along, God used him to reverse Israel's fortunes. He captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites, made Jerusalem his home, defeated the Philistines, and brought the ark to Jerusalem. Therefore, God's habitation, which had been in Shiloh of Ephraim, was now in Jerusalem. Verse 65. Then the Lord awakened as one out of sleep, like a mighty man who shouts by reason of wine. He struck his adversaries backward. He put them to a perpetual reproach. Moreover, he rejected the tent of Joseph and didn't choose the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. Comment: the ark wound up removed from Shiloh of Ephraim and was replaced in Jerusalem of Judah on Mount Zion. God loved that place. Verse 69. He built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has established forever. He also chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the ewes that have their young. He brought him to be the shepherd of Jacob, his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he was their shepherd according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Comment: that's the end of the mystery. That last part, the part about David, was actually in the mystery. That was the introduction of Christ into the story, because David was the prophetic forerunner of Jesus. That God chose David in that passage. He chose Jesus. He took David from the sheepfolds, from following the ewes that have their young, and brought him to be the shepherd of Jacob. God brought Jesus to be the shepherd of Israel, the shepherd of all the world, the shepherd of his people, of his inheritance. So the shepherd in verse 72 was according to the integrity of his heart. This Jesus was according to the integrity of God's heart. And this shepherd guided them by the skillfulness of his hands in verse 72. Jesus guides us by the skillfulness of his hands as David guided Israel. So that's the mystery revealed. It was still a mystery when Asaph wrote this psalm, but now it's been revealed. As Ephesians 3 verses 4 and 5 say, it's all about, quote, the mystery of Christ, which in other generations was not made known to the children of men, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit, end quote. Christ is the champion and final deliverance of men, not David. He's the answer to this long rebellious saga of man, this Christ who comes in his wisdom and skillfully leads his people to God. If we're believers, God gives us a personal exodus from the slavery of sin and hell. And like he delivered the Israelites into the promised land, he'll deliver us into the land of our promise, to the place he's prepared for us, John 14:2. He'll dwell with us and make us his habitation as he made his habitation in Jerusalem. That's the mystery revealed. But we shouldn't be disbelieving and rebellious as the Israelites so often were, or will forfeit all that. Just as God rejected many of them, he'll reject us as well if we're unbelieving and rebellious. Returning to verse 2 of the psalm, quote, I'll open my mouth in a parable, end quote. What followed, as we just read, was a parable of man's fecklessness to follow God and Christ's deliverance from all that. It was a history that really happened, but it was a parable of the much larger issue of man's rebellion and Christ's redemption. That's the enigma, the dark mystery, the thing we can't appreciate until God opens it up to us. There's much more correlation between the history of Israel and our personal Christian walk. So what we should do is go back and reread this psalm, which is an encapsulation of the history of Israel, so that those correlations jump out at us more. We should keep those correlations in mind as we read. Psalm 79 is next.